Hi, and welcome to Modernizing Consent with Dynamics 365. Today, we're here to learn more about how to leverage Dynamics 365 customer insights journeys to support consent and regulatory compliance for your communications with your customers. My name's Susana Ramos. I serve as the Director of Marketing Services for Coffee and Done. I come with about 15 years of marketing experience spanning both B2B and B2C, and I'm also certified in Dynamics 365 Customer Insights Journeys. With me today is Alex Greenbaum, one of our senior solution consultants, triple certified in both Power Platform and Customer Insights Journeys. A little bit about Coffee and Done. We are a Dynamics CE partner. Our goal is pretty simple. We want to be able to leverage Dynamics 365 to help customers solve their most pressing customer engagement challenges. And we do this through advisory, technology, and operation services. All right, before we jump in, a quick note. Again, the goal for today is for us to provide you with education and best practices on consent management pertaining to Dynamics 365. But as you know, it's about more than just one platform. So it's important to consult with your legal team to discuss how best to move forward with any organization-wide policies pertaining to consent management and make sure that it's best aligned with your business. With that, let's get into it. Today, we'll start by covering just a few benefits as it relates to consent in digital communication, as well as the consequence of status quo. We'll talk a little bit about just a high-level overview of Dynamics 365 Customer Insights Journeys for those of you who are less familiar with the platform. And then we'll zoom in and talk a bit more just about how consent management is managed, captured in the system. We'll talk about the comparison between outbound and real-time and the two different work areas related to consent, as well as for those of you who are just beginning or are planning to move over from outbound into real-time, some pitfalls and key considerations as it relates to that transition into the new work area. Finally, a summary and wrap up, along with our contact information should you have any questions about consent management or anything related to Dynamics 365 CE. Okay, before we get into the system, a few quick stats here. So leading marketing and IT experts know CAN spam is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to compliance. I'm sure you've heard of most of them. There's CASL, there's CCPA, GDPR. That's just just a few of the regulations that ultimately require marketers and companies to pay attention. When it comes to making consent a priority in the business, I think there are a few stats that are pretty noteworthy. The first is an obvious one, and that's just around potential revenue. Now, keep in mind, of course, email is not the only channel to consider when it comes to consent, but that market alone is estimated to be valued at nearly $18 billion by the year 2027. That is a significant amount of opportunity. And the last thing that we want to do is sever the chance to cultivate a relationship by having someone not provide or ultimately withdraw consent. The next stat is around engagement. So recognizing that something like an open rate is less of an important metric or more of a vanity metric, and focusing more on something like CTRs, the click-through rates for companies that are in compliance can be upwards of 20% versus just 2% for those companies that are not compliant. The next one I think is really interesting. Now, we'll start by saying that 3 out of 4 buyers, they are expecting a personalized buying experience, one that feels relevant to them. But here's where it gets really interesting. 83% of buyers are willing to share their data in order to help you curate that personalized buying experience. So not only are buyers today, even with ever-changing customer expectations, not only are they expecting an experience leading up to and beyond the purchase that feels relevant to them, but they're even willing to share their data in order to help us create that type of connected experience. Now, all of this kind of presents an opportunity, but there is a flip side to it. And when we think about inaction or kind of status quo, it's about more than just poor practices. When it comes to inaction related to compliance, the biggest risk that we see is when it comes to cost. There's a study from GlobalScape that shows that compliance or organizations, they typically spend 2.71 times the amount in cost when it comes to compliance versus those that are already considered compliant. That cost is coming from a few areas: business disruption, productivity, revenue losses, and the last one, fees, penalties, settlement costs. Those of you who are familiar with regulations like CAN-SPAM, CCPA, GDPR know that based on a few factors, a single incident can be pricey. It can be anywhere from the tens of thousands to the hundreds of thousands, and in some cases, over $1 million for just one incident. So the bottom line here is that in order to be able to maximize ROI on your marketing efforts, compliance and consent has to be a critical part of your marketing strategy. I'll turn it over to Alex to talk a little bit about what consent looks like in Dynamics 365 CI journeys. Alex, can you walk us through how this works?
Sure. Thanks, Susana. So before we actually get into consent, I want to provide you all with a more broad picture of Dynamics 365 Customer Insights journeys. It's a robust application with easy-to-use tools to help marketers conduct successful multi-channel campaigns that can be targeted to attract the right prospects. It also gives you lead nurturing capabilities that give you the insights to prioritize which leads to focus on and the tools to enable a seamless handoff of those leads to sales. There's opportunities for event management using a wide array of tools, including registration and attendance tracking from an events portal that can be created within Dynamics 365 Customer Insights. And you'll find rich insight gathering and reporting along with integrated customer voice survey capabilities. Dynamics 365 Customer Insights Journeys also runs on an adaptable unified platform, providing you with ready-built integrations with other Dynamics 365 products such as sales, as well as other content management systems. So it fits in easily with your other customer campaigns. With AI features such as spam checker and automated scheduler, you can improve the effectiveness of your email content and delivery time. Natural language queries for segmentation allow you to use common words and phrases to describe the people you want to include in dynamic and static segments without learning all the specifics of the common data model. Now, moving on to consent. Dynamics 365 helps organizations manage the end-to-end consent process, all the way from requesting to capturing and storing consent. Once consent is captured, Dynamics allows you to craft your marketing while ensuring that all consent given by your audience is respected throughout their life cycle. To start, consent is managed a bit different than you would see in other marketing automation platforms. In most, consent is related to a contact specifically, and on that contact record, you would likely see if someone is opted in or out of email and/or text. In real-time marketing, consent is contact point-based, meaning customers give consent for each point of contact. For example, they may have specific records for their email and/or their phone number. These records aren't directly related to their contact, but each time an email is sent to their email or that contact point, their consent record related to the email will be checked to see if they can receive it. Compliance profiles are where you store your consent details. You can have one if you're a smaller single brand business, or multiple if you're a global business and need to have multiple compliance profiles to account for various regions. Compliance profiles allow you to select from consent models, request consent from your customers on commercial, transactional, and tracking purposes, add your company's physical address, and to ultimately craft the content the end user will see on their preference page whenever they click into the link from their email. Consent models are used to determine how consent will be applied throughout the system. There's two options, restrictive and non-restrictive. In a restrictive model, the system looks for a clear opt-in, whereas in a non-restrictive model, the system looks for a clear opt-out when determining if it can send a message to a contact point consent record. It's important to note that consent models are ultimately how the system determines how consent is checked before sending email and text messages, so it really is an important part of the puzzle. The restrictive model is what's selected by default when you create a compliance profile, and as you can see in the name, since this model most obeys the use of explicit opt-ins to send messages, it tends to be the most compliant to regulations like GDPR, CCPA, and CAN-SPAM. The system does give you the opportunity to view and manage all of these contact point consent records in the Consent Center, where all of these records will appear in a list view. Lastly, I want to note a few things to keep in mind in relation to SMS and custom channel messages. Previously, we spoke about consent models, and it's important to know that for these, SMS and custom, they are subject to restrictive enforcement no matter what consent model is selected. For all commercial text messages, they will require an opted-in consent record. This will change in future release, and note that for email, it's always dependent on the purpose. Formatting is also important when considering SMS because the phone numbers need to be in a specific format to be used. And if you're curious what that looks like, it requires a country code and no dashes between the numbers. Now that you have a high-level understanding of the aspects that make up consent in real-time marketing, as well as some of their definitions, let's talk about the hierarchy and how consent is enforced. You can consider the compliance profile to be like an umbrella. It'll encompass your consent and how it's applied. Once again, there can be more than one compliance profile in the system, which is especially helpful when you have more than one brand and those brands have unique marketing and compliance requirements. Each compliance profile has its own preference center page that can be crafted to match the brand it's associated with, but we'll talk more about the preference center in a moment. Underneath each compliance profile are purposes. There's 3 purposes associated with each compliance profile: commercial, transactional, and tracking. These are out-of-the-box purposes that are unique to the compliance profile they're built within, and they can't be shared or used interchangeably across compliance profiles. However, you do get options to customize them within your compliance center. So for each purpose, you can choose how consent is applied. This is where those consent models really come into play. For example, many clients set their commercial purpose as restrictive so that only opted-in contacts receive marketing communications, but they may use a non-restrictive model for transactional communications so that everyone receives these required messages unless they physically opt themselves out. Lastly, under your purposes live topics. Think of these like subscription lists. They're optional and none are included out of the box, unlike your purposes. There's no limit to how many topics you can include. However, as a best practice, we recommend having no more than 5 in your preference center if possible to avoid abandonment. All right, let's jump back to that preference center. The preference center is a form that's created automatically for you when you create your compliance profile. Out of the box, the form includes a header and a subheader noting that the form is intended to update one's marketing preferences, a field that shows the email of the customer visiting the page, an unsubscribe from all button, and a submit button. This is easily customizable to match your organization's branding and to include fields like opt-ins to your commercial purpose, any topics you've created, your transactional and tracking purposes, as well as other common compliance requirements such as links to privacy policies and terms and conditions. When a customer selects the preference center or unsubscribe link at the bottom of their email, this is the form they'll see. They can then select or deselect boxes as they'd like to subscribe or unsubscribe themselves from specific communications, and their consent preferences will be updated in the system accordingly in their respective contact point consent records associated with the compliance profile. Before we move on, I'd like to cover how consent is applied and respected in the system to really bring this all together. So when you build out emails and text messages in the system, it's required that you select a compliance profile and purpose for it. There's one additional optional field for you to add a topic as well if you'd like. And what this all means is that when you craft a journey containing these emails and/or texts, that at every message, the system will check the compliance profile associated with the message, and then check that the contact points or customers in the list have a contact point consent record related to that compliance profile. If the purpose uses a restrictive model, the system will look for an opted-in contact point consent record to send the message. And if the purpose uses a non-restrictive model, the system will look for an opted-out contact point consent record. And if it doesn't exist, it'll send the message. To some, the compliance profile, purposes, and topics are some of the most important points of compliance in the system, and they work alongside contact point consent records to check consent at each point in your journeys to ensure your messages are only going to the portion of your audience with the correct consent. All right, so for those of you who are just getting into Dynamics 365 customer insights journeys, you may not actually see the outbound work area, but if you are transitioning, you'll see both. So these are some things to keep in mind as you make that move to real time from outbound. The main differences ultimately boil down to 3 areas: where consent is managed, how it's managed, and what's included in the preference centers. One large difference we've already touched on a bit is that in real-time marketing, consent is based on contact point consent records, again, an email, a phone number, etc. In outbound, it's likely more similar to what you typically see. Consent is tracked according to a contact and tracked on the contact record itself in a do not bulk email or a do not email field. I do have a few additional notes for you if you are one of those customers in transition from outbound to real-time marketing. The first is that those fields I mentioned, the do not bulk email and do not email fields on the contact record, are still actually used in the final consent checks and how consent is applied before deploying messages to a customer. Essentially, as of now, if those fields are noted as yes, meaning that they do not want to be bulk emailed or emailed, then they'll still actually be blocked from real-time marketing messages. This will change in the future, and if you're new to the system and don't have outbound marketing in your application, this doesn't actually apply to you. The second is that currently the consent found in real-time marketing and outbound are not in sync. What this means is that if you have emails and/or forms live in both work areas, that if someone opts themselves in or out from an asset in one work area, it won't update the consent associated with the same contact in the other work area. For example, if someone clicks into the preference center from an email deployed from outbound and unsubscribes, their consent in the real-time work area will not also be updated and vice versa. Again, if this were to happen, there is that final check of the outbound fields to prevent someone who may be opted in real time from receiving a message when they are actually opted out in outbound. The best way to resolve this is to make that full transition to real-time marketing, including all of your segmentation, emails, journeys, and forms. When you initially move over to real-time marketing from outbound, there is a button that allows you to import your consent data from outbound over to real-time marketing. It can be used to move consent in bulk, but it can also be used to add people to purposes and topics. Keep in mind, though, that this button is not intended to be used repetitively. It is really intended to be a one-time use to get you up and running. All right, jumping back to our differences, continuing with outbound, customers do manage their opt-ins and opt-outs of subscription lists in their preference centers, which updates their subscription preferences. This is what the system uses to determine if a message can be sent to that customer. On the other hand, in real-time marketing, we use those consent models I noted previously, along with contact point consent opt-ins and opt-outs to determine if a customer will receive a message. In the outbound preference center, you'll typically see a global opt-out and options for commercial communications via subscription lists by topics, but not transactional ones. One of the main differences here is that consent applies to all channels unless additional lists are created. In the real-time marketing preference center, you'll find a global opt-out with the ability to note a reason for the opt-out, so you can gather additional data on why customers don't want to receive those messages anymore. And customers can also manage their commercial and transactional consent to purposes, but also topics that align with those purposes. Lastly, another large difference is that consent is tracked and applied per channel rather than applied across the board. While there are differences, the goal really is the same. Customers can manually update their communication preferences. It's just that now in the real-time marketing environment, there's more possibilities for them to manage those preferences and further personalize what they would like to receive and not receive, while also giving you the ability to gather better data around those opt-ins and opt-outs. So it's worth taking a few steps outside of Dynamics before getting started within it so that you feel prepared to transition your consent model. The first is to know your team members. That may include marketing, sales, legal, and compliance. These are all important so that each team can share how they typically contact contacts and leads, how they know when they shouldn't contact them, any updates to data that may be necessary, and finally, legal is especially important to ensure that you're following your own company's and any global policies related to compliance. You absolutely want to ensure that your consent is up to date and is clean. If you think you have a lot of users that aren't engaging or their consent has expired, it might even be a good idea to run a re-engagement campaign of some kind and clean up your audience from there. There's two reasons that's important. The first is that contact point consent records will enable communication to be sent to multiple addresses or phone numbers, so you really want to ensure those are correct and up to date. The second is that since real-time marketing does check those do not email and do not bulk email fields on the contact entity, these fields, as well as any inclusions in marketing lists, are used as guidance to what the contact point consent is created with, so they do need to be accurate. We also recommend reviewing how you are capturing consent currently before transitioning so that you can adopt best practices when making the move. Practices like gathering explicit consent by using unchecked boxes and avoiding bundling consent, while also ensuring the link to the preference center and the ability to unsubscribe is clear and very straightforward, will ensure that you avoid spam complaints and ensure your data is correct and compliant. You'll want to ensure that you have all evidence of consent gathered or changed so that if someone requests it, it's readily available. Luckily, this is covered in Dynamics by using contact point consent records and auditing. Lastly, we do recommend finding a consulting partner that's well-versed in the latest from Dynamics 365 customer insights, journeys, and data to ensure that you're covering all of your bases when transitioning.
Thanks, Alex. So today we walked through how to leverage Dynamics 365 to help modernize your consent. So as a recap, first, consent is an investment, but the risk of non-compliance can hurt your bottom line. So again, it's important to ensure that consent becomes a critical part of your marketing strategy. As it relates to Dynamics 365 Customer Insights, the tool does offer flexible models that best align with your business needs. So whether you need to look at a more restrictive or non-restrictive model, the system really allows you to ensure that this is the best fit for your organization. And finally, for those of you who are transitioning from Outbound into real-time, now's the time to take a step back, look at your current practices, see what works, what doesn't, ensure you have the right stakeholders in the room, and use this as an opportunity to perform any data hygiene to ensure that your data is in the best shape possible to ensure that it's fully supported as you start to leverage any new consent models within the real-time marketing module in Dynamics. Finally, get familiar with the two different work areas. Alex pointed out a lot of really great things as it relates to how consent is captured and managed in the system. Any additional training that you can do to increase your tool confidence as it relates to consent management in Dynamics 365 CI journeys will be a win. Thank you for watching, and for any questions on Dynamics 365 CE, on consent management and more, please reach out. We're more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thanks again for watching.